Hey, welcome back to Travillian Next. I'm your host, Amber Buker, and this month, March, is Women's History Month. So we wanted to bring you a conversation with one of the sharpest women in the industry on the practical tactics that your bank can use to recruit more women into leadership. Recent research from the Fed that's specific to women's impact in banking finds a positive impact on ROA, revenue to expense ratio, and stock price growth, but only if your board can reach a certain threshold of gender diversity. Today, we'll learn more about that threshold, how to run a better board succession process, and how to find candidates outside of your existing network. The expert joining me today is Jen Docherty. She has more than 25 years of experience as a senior banking and legal advisor, and she wears several hats in the industry, serving as FIG Capital Markets Strategist at Performance Trust Capital Partners, a board member and Audit Finance Committee Chair for Sunrise Banks, and the co-founder and CEO of the nonprofit Bank on Women. So let's dive in. Hey, Jen, it is so exciting to have you. How are you today?
I'm great, Amber. Thank you for having me.
Of course. So we're just going to dive right into it. I love data. The Fed has run the numbers, and having women on bank boards, the research shows, has a positive impact on bank performance and less of a chance to have regulatory issues or consent orders against your institution. But those benefits really only start accruing at a certain point in gender parity on the board, like at a certain threshold level of diversity. So can you tell us, Jen, what about some of these numbers that have come out in terms of how women on boards can impact a bank in the positive, and what threshold do you really need to be at to start to reap some of those benefits?
Sure. It's a great question, Amber, because I hear often, I'd love to put a woman on my board. And there are a lot of problematic sentiments behind that statement. There are a lot of positive sentiments, but it sort of misses the point. There are lots of studies that have been done that show a correlation between having women on boards, could be bank board, it could be outside of the banking sector, and improvement in performance. There was a wonderful study that was done for banks specifically. There's two economists at the Federal Reserve Board. At least one is now in private practice teaching economics. But it was a longitudinal study of banks over a period of about 17 years. And it looked at all banks during that time period, including during the great financial crisis. What the study showed was that once you have a critical mass, it's an important term I'll come back to, but once you have a critical mass of women on the board, you really start to see significant improvements that probably go beyond the correlation. And you start to infer some causation in profitability, in whether it's ROA, ROE, in efficiency, in risk adjusted. And what was so interesting about the study is it showed that those positive benefits were exacerbated during times of stress. So during the financial crisis, the banks that had a critical mass of women on the board significantly outperformed those that don't. So critical mass is, mathematically, it's a third. And I'll tell sort of a short joke that I think will illustrate this. The joke is, what happens when you have one woman on the board? All the guys wonder what she's thinking. What happens when you have two women on the board? All the guys wonder what they're talking about in the ladies' room. What happens when you have three women on the board? Nobody notices. And the punchline behind that is really simple. If you are the only one who's deemed to represent an entire group, let's face it, we want people on boards who bring different perspectives, who can help us see blind spots. So not surprisingly, during times of stress, when risk management is critical, you really need people who can see the world differently. But no single woman could be a stand-in to represent 50% of the population. So it's really sort of a heavy burden. And if everybody's sort of looking at that one person in the room as a token, as opposed to being there because of the expertise that she brings, the background that she brings, it's very, very hard for that one person to really fully perform as a board member and bring the best to bear. And so this correlation, once you reach a critical mass, is really kind of a critical tipping point that we joke about it, but you can really start to understand why that matters. It also goes further to evidence that if you are not just bringing somebody on the board because they represent a certain demographic group, and listen, it's important. Community banks are representative, should be representative of their demographics. But if you're simply putting somebody on the board, I mentioned the problematic statement, someone just because she's a woman, that's probably not going to be the best fit for your board. And quite frankly, your board probably isn't going to take that person as seriously if they're not there for some merit-based reason. Now, there are lots of issues aside about how bank directors are recruited not based on merit, but based on who. And we'll get into some of those questions in a little bit, I know. But having a bank that is committed to best practices around governance, what skill sets they're going to need for the future, not just looking retroactively for the last 25 years, you start to understand those dynamics. It's not so surprising the banks that have really committed themselves to that are outperforming those who haven't.
So that's really interesting that, especially in times of stress, women on boards are performing very well for your institution. Want to reiterate that 1/3 number. So if you have a bank board and you're looking to reap the benefits of having women in those key roles, they can't just be a token woman. We need at least 1/3 of the board to be female. So that's kind of a tough hill to climb. If I'm a director sitting here thinking like, okay, well, I need more women, but I can't go out and just try to get the women. Like, you can't just go out and say, we need women, let's do that, right? So how does a director even start to unpick like how to improve the gender representation on their board? Does it depend on where they're starting from? But yeah, generally, if you can't say, let's go get the women, how do you go get the women?
I'm going to put two different hats on at the moment. So I do a lot of work with banks around governance, and as well as the work that I do with Bank on Women. And what we found is that good governance is good governance. And so banks have a very difficult time. The average tenure of most bank directors is 25 years plus. And so a lot of banks are saddled with boards that were very, very constructive for them years ago, but aren't the type of board you need for the banks of the future. There are a lot of different pressures facing the banking industry, particularly community banks. Hopefully we'll get some relief with tailoring on the regulatory side. But there are a lot of different pressures that didn't exist for banks 20 years ago. Just generally speaking, banks are all wrestling with the challenge of having directors that are best suited to bring them forward. So you have to start somewhere. Start with ascertaining what are the expertise I have on the board. What are my networks like? What is my succession planning for my board? Am I intentional about my succession planning? Or am I just relying on Joe retiring or rolling off the board at some point if you have term limits and asking everyone else around the board table, who do you know? I can promise you that if you're relying on just the extension of the couple of people in those room, you are never going to find the most qualified board candidate. And if you don't know what sorts of expertise you're going to need, you're going to default to Joe's buddy at the golf club, which by definition is a very, very narrow pool. There's a wonderful study done by the same economists, actually, at the Federal Reserve that looked at the overlap of social connections within boardrooms. And this is a little bit of a confusing statistic, but the median overlap between men on the same bank board was about 60%. So in other words, about 60% of them had overlapping social connections with another man on that board. If there happened to be more than one woman on a bank board, there was about a 20% overlap in social connections. But there was zero overlap in the social connections between men and women on the same bank board. Meaning they lived in the same community, they worked in the same community, but they just weren't running in the same circles. And another joke, if you're trying to find the board of the future, you're probably not going to find a woman. You're certainly probably not going to find the best candidate recruiting from your local golf and hunting club. Now, there are benefits to knowing other community members, right? I mean, the nature of community banking is still very, very much tied into where you live. But the fact of the matter is, without those social connections, if we're just recruiting on the basis of friends and family, we might find somebody we know or know of, but we're not going to find the best candidate for the role. And so to answer your question in a very long-winded way, the place to start is by expanding beyond just friends and family. I had a CEO, actually a chair once, who said to me, I have very, very thoughtful board succession planning. I gather names, and I meet with candidates at least quarterly for lunch, at least 2 years before going on the board. Now that seemed a little bit rigid, but the point was he was actively thinking about it. Yeah. He was looking to get introduced to people that he didn't know. I think just being aware of the limitation of the way that we have historically recruited board members, of the skill sets, or not even being observant of the types of skill sets that we have on the board or those that we need. I think just starting to shed light on those then starts to lead to, and we can talk a little bit more about how you identify candidates, but just being aware that the pool you're fishing in is probably a tiny lake and not the wide ocean.
Well, and I love the point of know what you need on the board, right? Because that's going to give you an excuse, an impetus, a reason to proactively expand your
Yes.
network. Okay, we don't have anyone on the board that knows technology or cybersecurity. How do we find that person? We ask around, right? We get proactive. We go on LinkedIn. We ask our investment bankers or whoever who they know. And so that makes sense that that's a very natural place to start, is just figure out what you need on the board and then go from there to try to open up some of these other dimensions of connections that you might have. So when we're thinking about banks and what it means to be a traditional bank, a lot of banks are very heavily run by female employee bases. So banking as a whole, you probably have much better stats than I do, but a lot of times banking is majority female. But what we often see is that is very true in the lower level roles. And then as you start to work your way up into executive suites, those numbers drop precipitously as you go higher and higher. And then typically once you get to that really high C level, it's typically like HR, marketing, and those kind of are the typical C-suite roles that we find women in. And that's just kind of how it shakes out from my observation and research that I've done in the past on this. So what do you think, Jen, are some of the structural barriers in banking that make it so that we have so many women, yet so few of them making it to the top?
It's a great question, Amber, and I'm sure given the work that Travillian does, you have seen some of the consequences of this. Succession is a big challenge for banks right now. We've got a lot of retirements among CEOs. Quite frankly, that's driving a lot of sale events, which management teams and boards may, and owners, quite frankly, may not otherwise prefer, but there's a lack of succession. There's a real pipeline challenge. Let me give you a couple of specific answers, though, on the structural impediment. So banks are, by and large, run by women, meaning more than 60% on average of a bank's employees are women. As in a little story, I have spent a lot of time, over more years than I will admit on this podcast here, but a lot of time raising capital for banks. And so the first place you always start is with management interviews. And you ask the CEO and you ask the senior management what their backgrounds are. I have never met a CEO that hasn't done at least a dozen or more jobs at a bank, and often several banks, before they get to the role of CEO. So there is a lot of experience that you need to bring to bear to be CEO. The view, however, historically has been you have to have run a P&L, you have to have been a lender. Men are twice as likely to get recommended for P&L roles. They are twice as likely to report having somebody sponsor them compared to women. And then there are a couple of concepts known as the first rung, the broken first rung of the ladder. Women and men ask for promotions at the same rate. Men are at 100%, women are at 86% likely to get those first promotions. So you see this drop off. Men tend to be promoted on the basis of what they can achieve. Women tend to be promoted on the basis of what they have achieved. And there's just this natural instinct. You think about, until you've done a job, you don't really know that you can do it. So having that senior champion who says, hey, I see myself in you 10 years ago, 20 years ago, I know you can do this. I'm going to put you in a position to be successful, using your political capital for somebody. So these are very second nature traits, but they tend to inadvertently keep women out of positions that would give them the opportunity to advance and acquire the skills, I'll say, that we think are necessary to be CEO. Being able to lend, being able to run a P&L, or having run a P&L, are not necessarily the most important skill sets to be a CEO today. The ability to innovate, the ability to navigate people skills. We see more and more CEOs coming from the digital side. That has become far more important for banks today. So I think there's a lot in what I just indicated there. But again, it's about bringing awareness, looking for talented people in your organization and pushing them to try something different. There's a concept known as the confidence gap. And there's some wonderful research on this. And the long and short of it is, if you were to administer the same test, it could be a memory test. Remember these 20 shapes and these 20 letters. Men will ascertain that they have done better at that test before getting the results by about a third. Women will ascertain that they have done about a third worse than their actual performance. And so this idea of being confident, we tend to conflate with competence. So it's just starting to bring awareness that we as managers sometimes need to push women a little bit harder, need to lend our political capital, at least be aware of our biases and the biases of our employees, because there are plenty of talented bankers out there. Just a lot of them tend to leave when they don't have the same opportunities.
Absolutely. And that confidence piece, it goes even just to applying for a position. So that sponsorship in the organization is so key, not just because it might give a woman the confidence to know that they're connected and that they're supported in the org, but also to say, hey, Jen, I think you would be really great at this job. You should apply for that. And Jen's like, well, I saw it, but I just didn't think, because there's also some research that shows that men are much more willing to apply for a job if they only have like 40% of the criteria that they meet, they'll go ahead and apply. Women require 80 or 90% certainty that they meet all the requirements before they will even apply. So having a sponsor that can say, I'm thinking of you for this. And even just if you're in a larger organization, especially just flagging that the opportunity even exists can be very helpful. And we've thrown around the word sponsorship a few times. I want to really hone in on that quickly, because there is a difference between sponsorship and mentorship. And sponsorship is taking ownership, in my view, and I want to throw this to you and see if you kind of agree or how you disagree.
No, it's an important distinction.
It is distinct, because sponsorship is more about putting your own personal capital on the line to support this other peer junior person to you. Whereas mentorship can be, come shadow me and I'll tell you how I do my job for a day, and then maybe we'll be connected. Maybe there's a little program where we talk twice a month for a quarter, and then the program goes away. No, sponsorship is like something very different. So can you talk about how you view those?
Yeah, and honestly, I have to give credit to former acting controller Mike Sue, who has done some speaking for Bank on Women. He was a wonderful advocate for us, but he articulated it, I think, most clearly. Mentorship is what somebody with more experience will tell you. You should do this, you should try that. They'll give you advice. Sponsorship is what they're saying when you're not in the room. And in particular, lending their political capital. So probably one of the most impactful moments in my career was walking into a boardroom with a very, very senior member of my team, who the first words out of his mouth after introductions were, "Don't talk to me, talk to Jen. She's the person who will have the answers you need. She is the expert here." He lent me his political capital, completely changed the ability of me to navigate that discussion and for me to continue to build my relationship. So that was a very powerful moment for me to experience that personally and see how transformative that can be. So if you think about what that can do across, come back to your earlier question, Amber, across an organization, when we're thinking about succession, it's years and years and years of that with many different people that allows you to continue to cultivate that pipeline to the more senior levels. We spend a lot of time and investment in training, in recruiting people. We spend so much time talking about how do you recruit the best people. My question is, how do you retain the best people? And sponsorship is really key. If you've got somebody who's doing a good job, it's incumbent on you as a manager to figure out how to keep them there and to continue to help them grow.
Retention is crucial for banks, especially at a time when we're seeing the leadership pipeline dry up. I mean, you mentioned earlier that we're seeing more deals happening just because of a lack of succession planning.
Absolutely.
And a little Easter egg, that may or may not be something that I'm working on some research for right this second. It's an interesting thing that I'm trying to figure out in the data. Like, can we see this impending kind of retirement?
I would be so curious. You'll have to do a postscript to this. I'd be very curious to see what the results of that are. I mean, just anecdotally, being in the business of investment banking, we hear and see that a lot.
Yeah. Okay, so I want to get to, before we leave, Bank on Women, your organization. Tell us what you guys actually do. So if a CEO is listening to this conversation and they go, gosh, I'm really sick that I'm missing out on all this performance that I could be having and all of these benefits, I got to call Jen. What happens when they call you?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. So I guess just to take a quick step back, so I never set out to co-found a nonprofit or run a nonprofit.
I find that people that do that rarely do.
Yeah,
Called.
it's wonderful to be able to be moved by and support a passion. I mean, I've been very fortunate that the organizations I've worked for have seen the benefit and have been really encouraging to me to do this and understand the investment in community banking ultimately is serves all. But Bank on Women came out of an idea that really we just touched on, was this idea of succession. And so my co-founder Terry Spiro had run banks in the Mid-Atlantic for a long time. And she and I started talking about how frustrating it was. We'd seen so much talent come into the community bank space and leave. And that was true within banks. It was true within the service providers like investment banks and law firms and auditing firms. And so we just continued the conversation and tried to figure out what we could do to make an impact. The first thing we did was we built what's now a database. At the time, it was a Excel spreadsheet of the first 50 names that popped into our heads of women who we knew would make great board directors. I was at Sandler at the time, and we would get a lot of requests, and this is true now, Performance Trust, we get a lot of requests for recommendations for board seats. And I had literally seen the same man's name suggested for 4 bank rolls in a row. And this was somebody who sat on at least 2 bank boards at all times, very talented. But it was clear there was a need here to be filled. And so we pretty quickly came up with a list of 50 names. And then we realized this was not the field of dreams. Just because we built it, then people were going to come. And we really needed to start to let folks know that this was something we had. And what we quickly ended up toggling into was really becoming an educational based nonprofit. We do a lot of speaking, but a lot of one-on-one with boards, just helping boards understand why this is not just about having a woman on the board, but what does your employee base look like? What are the demographics of the market that you're trying to lend into? What areas are you not tapping into? How sophisticated is your governance? It really is sort of a holistic approach to the strategic benefits. Banking is not getting easier, particularly for community banks. And I mentioned that hopefully we get some relief and some tailoring. But if there's something you can do that's sort of low-hanging fruit, why wouldn't you? We started to track actually the performance of NASDAQ traded banks correlated to board composition. Since 2021, every single quarter, NASDAQ traded bank holding companies that have a critical mass of women on the board outperform those that don't, regardless of where industry ROAs and ROEs are, every single quarter. So to come back to your question, we spent a lot of time just educating boards about why this matters. I will tell you, most banks get it. What they don't have is the how. And so that's where Bank on Women has really tried to grow up and meet the industry where it is. As much as I would love banks to professionalize their search for directors, because there are huge advantages. You guys have great vetting and great pools of candidates, but so many banks aren't utilizing those services. And so we've grown up to be a two degrees of separation. We now maintain a database of potential board candidates that is segregated out by the most often sought for skills: technology, small business ownership experience, audit and finance expertise, real estate expertise. And so we work with banks. And my approach is as tailored as the bank itself. So some banks just want to understand, they just want to start educating their board. Other banks want to be pointed to resources to help start to diagnose what they need on their board. Still, other banks say, I don't want to be introduced to anyone, but how do I go about tapping into the resources in my own market? And then any number of banks, we probably work with about 4 or 5 a year, say, can you introduce me to somebody? Here are and then we'll help them go through a gap analysis. Here are the skill sets that I need. So it really is made to suit. We really want banks to still continue to feel comfortable like it's somebody they know, because they know us. But that has been wonderfully reaffirming to be able to actually help get more and more talent into the community banking space at the leadership level. The other thing we've been doing over the last few years is just really on this pipeline question that you've come back to a few times, Amber, because I think it is so important for the continuity of the community bank space, which is we've created peer groups, some regional peer groups, some peer groups by role, to try to bring together women across the banking industry to help support each other, to network with each other. Those, quite frankly, been a lot of fun and a lot of reward. But the goal really continues to be, what can we do to keep talent in the community bank space to help the industry?
That makes so much sense. You've got the groups for the women who then become part of the pipeline, right? So whether you're a bank leader looking to increase diversity, a female leader in banking looking to find other women and put your name in the hat for big opportunities, on Women is the place to go. Jen, any final thoughts? And what's your website? Where can people go to find you? Where would you like them to reach out?
Thank you, Amber. So bankonwomen.org is our website. There are any number of ways to reach us. The website is actually segregated into a few different buckets. So if you are women who could serve on a bank board, there's a way to register for our database, and then we go through vetting from there. If you are the CEO or chair of a bank and would like to have a conversation about how we might be able to help, there's a separate form for you there. And then if you're interested in getting involved in any of our peer groups, there's a separate form there. I've been around a while. I think a lot of folks probably have my contact information.
I mean, I really think working with the organization, part of the huge benefit is getting to work with you and getting to know you, because your network and experience is just so deep. I've really enjoyed getting to know you in the little bit that we have, and look forward to keeping in touch, because you're just like a wealth of information. So yeah, any final, sorry I interrupted you. Just
No, not at all, Amber. And I appreciate that. As I said earlier, I feel very, very fortunate to be able to do this. I don't even call it work. There's just, I went to law school in Philly, and I spent a lot of time, I live in New Jersey. I spent a lot of time on the train back and forth between New York City and DC. And when I was in law school, I would run around the track to blow off steam, and with my roommate at the time. And every time I go past the train and I look out and I see the track, and I think about what was motivating me. And you and I have talked about how hard law school is. Just getting through law school is usually enough preparation for whatever else life might throw at you. But I think about what was it that was motivating me in law school? And it was the sense that, I don't know, at 21 years old, what it was going to look like, but being able to do something to have an impact, to make the world a little bit better. I love being around people. I love the experience. So at a certain point, I was sitting on the train and I thought, what am I going to do? Like, I've now got the place where hopefully I've got some political capital. I've got some relationships. I've got some experience. Like, if not now, when? So to be able to actualize that feeling at 21 years old, being able to do something where you feel like you're leaving the world a little bit of a better place. And I've got 2 kids now, and I hope I can leave things a little bit better off for them. Like, I just feel very lucky. So I appreciate you saying that. And I obviously appreciate the opportunity to be here, but I'm pretty grateful for it as well.
Well, Jen, thank you so much. Everyone, reach out to Bank on Women, and we'll be back for more shortly. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Amber.